Hello everyone and welcome back to Brown Coat Reviews. I'm your host Laura. So we are in the middle of our 30-day challenge, which is we are going to post 30 videos in 30 days. Oh my goodness. So please subscribe, like, and share these videos because the sooner we grow, the sooner I can include a lot of amazing content. We of course have already planned a lot of great comic book reviews, discussions that we're going to have like today. We have a lot of collections that I'm going to showcase, some behind the scenes features, and I have some amazing bonus things planned. I can't wait to show you all. Now, the last video that I posted was about Zenescope. And yes, Zenescope is a bit of a double-edged sword where you have the writing, especially the earlier stuff that is just amazing, and then you have the later emphasis on some of the severely bodacious artwork. So, I wanted to talk to you today about the writing. Last time we talked about the artwork, today is all about the writing. And I wanted to talk to you about the GrimmFairyTales. Why? Because the GrimmFairyTales in general, this series, especially, like I said, the first, I think it's about eight or nine maybe volumes of this series are phenomenal. After a while, I think they sort of lost their stride, but the beginning had an amazing concept. So, what are the GrimmFairyTales? We, of course, know the traditional GrimmFairyTales. They are dark and twisty, moral tales meant to tell children to obey their parents, or what happens when they are disobedient. They are scary, they are terrifying, and they are nothing like their Disney counterparts. So what Zenescope did with their series is they created their own version of the GrimmFairyTales. So most of the stories start with this initial concept of you have your strange characters that are only introduced for that one issue, typically. They are presented with a challenge, a life decision, important moment in their life, and they aren't sure what to do. And in walks one of two characters, either Seela or Belinda. Seela is a smart, good character. She has dark brown hair, black hair technically, and glasses. And you have Belinda, who is your devious character, and she has fiery red hair. So they will present you with the GrimmFairyTales book, and typically they will recommend that you read a story. And then you jump into the GrimmFairyTales book and you read the storyline, and then you get to choose what action you're going to take. There are some cases where the strangers will go with the recommendation of Seela or Belinda, and sometimes it will be the right thing, and sometimes it will be the wrong thing. Because Seela and Belinda are both good and evil, sometimes Seela will be encouraging you to do the right thing, and sometimes Belinda will purposefully pick a book in the GrimmFairyTale story that will tell you to do the wrong thing. So she's actually leading you astray. So you don't know which way the story is trying to persuade you unless you knew the characters from the beginning. So really, really cool series, and it's a great little dichotomy of these two women who are just always kind of battling it out to get to these people first and give them the correct direction. And what happens when they are led astray? What happens when they mess up? What happens when they ignore the good advice that's given from the GrimmFairyTales? It gets really interesting. Now, you all know that I am a fan of stories. I love to read and I love to analyze different storylines. Very, very guilty as charged. I decided that I was going to try something. I decided that I was going to read the original GrimmFairyTale, and then I was going to read the Zenescope GrimmFairyTale and see how different it was. And what I discovered was, again, the example of the writing that I knew Zenescope had the capability of doing, but for me, from a writing standpoint, just made me admire them even more. What do I mean? Let's take a look at RedRidingHood. In the GrimmFairyTales of RedRidingHood, the story is pretty straightforward. You have Red Riding Hood, who's going to go visit Grandma. Her mother tells her, don't stray off the path and head straight to Grandma's. don't talk to strangers. She heads out into the woods, she meets a wolf, she talks to a stranger, and he persuades her to leave the path and go pick some flowers for Grandma. He goes off and he kills Grandma. Eats her. Then Red Riding Hood arrives, and he eats Red Riding Hood too. This is where Grimm gets just a little bit more gory. The huntsman hears the snores coming from the wolf, who is now asleep in Grandma's bed. And he says, this is my favorite part, says, "At last I find you, you old sinner. I have been looking for you a long time." And he takes a pair of shears and he cuts the wolf's skin and frees the still alive Grandma and Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood is the one who decides to fill the wolf's sort of empty casing of his body with large stones, so that way when he wakes up, the weight will hold him down and it will instantly kill him. Okay. So they kill that wolf. Huntsman ends up with the wolf's skin. Grandma is alive, and Red Riding Hood promises that she will always obey her mother. That's not the end of the story. Red Riding Hood comes home. She gets another package for Grandma. She heads out into the woods. She meets a second wolf. And this wolf, of course, tries to do the same thing, except this time she does not listen and she goes straight to Grandma's house. The wolf knocks on the door pretending to be Red Riding Hood, and neither Grandma nor Red Riding Hood are willing to open the door. So instead, the wolf climbs up on the roof and tries to wait until Red Riding Hood leaves to kill her at that time. Grandma realizes what's happening, so she takes a pot that she had been boiling sausages in, and she fills it with water and then starts taking that hot water and putting it in the trough that is right out front of her house. And Red Riding Hood just keeps filling the trough until it's all the way to the top. The wolf peers over the edge of the roof, smelling the sausages from the water, and falls over, falls into the trough, and drowns. And Red Riding Hood is happy, Grandma is happy, no one was eaten by a wolf, 2 wolves are dead, and we all get to cheer. But the important moral of the story was, this is what happens when you obey your parents, you get to defeat the wolf, and when you disobey your parents, you get eaten by one. Okay. That simplistic, severely simplistic storyline is what Zenescope used in their very first story of Red Riding Hood. You ready to hear about this story? Now, I am going to release a lot of spoilers. We're actually going to go through the entire story. I'm going to do this on purpose because I know a lot of people out there have not read Zenescope's books. And I'm going to just spoil the very first issue because if you're interested, we can continue with the rest of the series and we can keep comparing these different storylines. But I know some of you may never, ever read Zenescope. So this is my way of at least showing off the writing that I keep talking about. And if you're not interested, you're not interested. So let's jump into Zenescope. So this is Zenescope's Red Riding Hood. We start the story with Chad and Brittany. They're fooling around on the couch, and Chad is trying to initiate sex, and Brittany is the one who says that she's just not ready. He gets upset, starts yelling at her, and storms off and says, "You know what, call me when you're ready to grow up." She gets upset and she runs to her bedroom. In her bedroom, she finds the GrimmFairyTale book, and she flips to the story of Red Riding Hood. And now we jump into the story. In here, we have Red Riding Hood on her way to her grandmother's house, and she runs into Samuel. Samuel is a nobleman whose father, of course, disapproves of his relationship with Red Riding Hood. She has already slept with him, and of course he wants to do it again, but she tells him that she made a mistake and she should have waited until marriage, and she will not sleep with him until they are married, and what she wants is that they go to the village fair together, and he says he just can't do it. So she leaves him, and he broods. She goes off into the woods, scary times, and then she runs into our huntsman, which is Jacob. Jacob is clearly interested in Red Riding Hood. He offers to escort her through the woods. She refuses. So instead, he at least convinces her to take a knife for protection. She heads off into the woods, and then she starts being followed by wolves. She continues to run, tries to save herself, and then there is a werewolf about. Werewolf transforms, and it is the werewolf that attacks her grandmother. Red Riding Hood, after running from the wolves, arrives at Grandma's house, sees the blood, and sees what has happened. She turns around after seeing the bloodshed and what has happened to her grandmother and sees Jacob. Immediately, she stabs him, thinking that he was the werewolf, and then is confronted by the werewolf. And it is actually Jacob who protects her from the werewolf. And the werewolf then transforms into Samuel, and while Samuel sits there and dies in the corner, it is Red Riding Hood who comforts Jacob. And now we get back to Brittany. And Brittany realizes that she should never have bothered with Chad. She breaks things off, and she looks into the mirror and she sees the cut on her face and the leaves on the bed. So maybe her story wasn't as fake or dreamlike as she thought it was. So why did I tell you all this? Now, I wanted to show you the original Grimm fairy tale story, which, like I said, is just purely a moral story. It is meant to teach children to obey their parents. Not really much more. What this Grimm fairy tale story did is it took that incredibly simple moral tale and it decided to teach women something more. And especially when you compare it with the objectification of women that Zenescope sadly is really well known for, this, on the other hand, is teaching women that it is okay to tell your boyfriend, no, you're not ready. And how that lust that he has from within him transforms, and makes him into a werewolf. Yes, it's a story, blah, blah, blah. But you see that kind of monster within him consumes him. And that is why he attacks the grandmother. That's why he goes after Red Riding Hood. He just cannot control his internal lusts. And how important it was for Red Riding Hood to stand up for herself, pick the right man, but also stand by her stance that she was going to wait until marriage. Even though, yes, she'd already slept with Samuel, but now she realized it was a mistake and she was going to wait. So, Brittany decided to be strong as well, tell her boyfriend Chad to stick it, where he needed to go far, far away anyways. But she realized the importance of standing up for herself. It's not the kind of story that you would figure would come from Zenescope. That's why I keep saying the writing is great. It is actually a story of female empowerment. They're just getting people so distracted by the artwork. And I mean, come on, look at this artwork. This is ridiculous. What the heck is Red Riding Hood wearing? I don't know. But why don't we focus in on the rest of the artwork where, just look at that cool, creepy, scary cover. Why can't we have that? Like I said, sex sells, but the stories are good. So, the other thing that I wanted to point out, like I said, from the writer's perspective, is if I was given this Grimm fairy tale book and said, okay, make it interesting, make it applicable to modern day, make this a story for not just little children, make it a story for adults going through that same moral dilemma. Would I have come up with a tale of wolves, werewolves, and two men fighting for the same woman? No. I can tell you right now, absolutely not. And even with my creative juices, I still could not have come up with this story. Does it mean that what I would have come up with it would have been terrible in comparison? No. What it means is that it took so much creativity to jump and transform that story into what I personally think is actually a better story. Yes, I love the original Grimm fairy tale, but it's clearly just a simple two-dimensional story that's just teaching you, don't listen to wolves. Okay. Listen to your mother. Trust your mother. Don't trust the wolf. Drown them, kill them, fill their bodies and cavities with stones. This story, on the other hand, is giving you something more. And this exact dilemma of the boyfriend trying to push the girlfriend into sex and her saying no, I think pretty much every woman who has ever dated a man has had that exact moment. And some men react well to it and some men do not. But the whole point of this is not to just say, well, maybe it's okay to give in to your baser instincts. It's saying, you know what? There are sometimes consequences to your actions. And sometimes giving in to that animal instinct isn't always good. It can have consequences. Think before you jump into something as serious as sex. It's a great story. And I tell you, the rest of these stories are also very intriguing. But I'd love to hear from you all first, before I start jumping into all the different Grimm fairy tales that I read first, and then what Zenescope did with them, just because I find it fascinating. Just because I find it fascinating does not mean that you do too. So I'd actually love to hear from you all. Write down in the comments. Tell me what you thought. What did you think? Does this make you more interested in the writing available by Zenescope, or are you just so turned off by the artwork that there's nothing I can say about the writing that could ever convince you? Were you surprised that this technically was the very first Zenescope comic book that they released, and it was not encouraging the sexual nature that sometimes is displayed on their covers? I was. Do you want to hear more Zenescope content? Because I have more golden gems where that came from. So, tell me what you think, because I'd love to hear from you all. Now, this is Laura from Brown Coat Reviews, and I will see you all next time.